So confidence and fear are two terms in a governance system for a democracy. Confidence, when I say confidence, I don't mean ignoring risks and threats. What I mean is you explain to your citizens that the new emerging threat can be handled. Here's how you're going to handle it. We have an actual written plan. Here's the plan. Give us feedback. You're participative. We've built this plan, but there could be holes in the plan. Please give us your feedback. You encourage feedback. You don't tell people that if they talk back to you, the police will come and arrest you. You say, I want your feedback. So a confidence-based system is you very openly create that plan with the public constantly, iteratively.
Hmm.
Then once you've got the plan, you publish it in a written form through the media so that everyone gets a copy and then knows exactly how to give feedback, and they can watch the plan unfold, and they have now confidence in that elected the right people, and that those people, if they stray from the path, can be unelected and replaced.
Welcome to another episode of Dialogue Over Division, and I have yet again former Lieutenant Colonel David Redman to take us through his 6 national interests that he's identified to help make a nation strong and free and prosperous, and all the things I think that Canadians are desperately searching for right now. And I have to say, I'm incredibly excited for today's topic because it's always the topic that I seem to go to, that I defer to, and it's good governance. So we've gone through unity, national security, and good governance. So I don't know if it's just me that people seem to defer to this end, but clearly it's an important topic, but there is more to it. So like I said, I'm excited to dive into this one. I don't know if you want to start with a little introduction again and then take us into what it is that your overview of good governance is, but either way, I'm looking forward to it.
Okay, thank you, Eva. Um, so I just want to make sure for people that are perhaps watching this as a one-off, just to understand the premise. I wrote a paper back in 2024 called Canada 2024, A Strong Resilient Nation or a Fearful Fractured Country. And in it, I tried to give people the understanding that in order to have a strong and vibrant country, you need to present a 25-year vision, a vision where you want your country to travel to and how to achieve it based on the 6 national interests that define any nation. And each of those national interests is integrated. They don't stand alone, they're integrated, but each of them must be clearly defined by leadership so that the citizens of the country understand and know what the intent is of the leaders that they're going to elect. Particularly vital in a democracy where you choose between different leaders. And so, always important that each person who wishes to lead our beautiful country of Canada defines very clearly for the citizens of the country where they believe the country should be and could be in 25 years. And then the citizens can pick between the leaders and decide which leader they believe A has the best vision and B has an actual plan to get to that vision based on all 6 national interests. And so, yeah, we've already discussed that the first two, unity and national security. And the reason I always put them first and expect people, politicians, leaders, to define them first is, in simplest terms, a country is defined when a group of people with common ethics, values, and interests live within a defined geography with borders that they are prepared to defend. So that's why first unity, a group of people who share common ethics, beliefs, and values, who come together to form a nation, but then define what that nation is in terms of actual physical boundaries, and they are prepared to defend those boundaries and all those pieces of national security that we discussed last time, all 7 elements that are required to actually define that country. So now we come to good governance. Now, governance in a democracy is quintessential. Once you've defined that you have a group of people and a clearly defined geography, for a democracy, good governance allows the nation to have confidence, not fear. That leaders never lead by fear. Fear only is used to divide and to break up a democracy. Confidence is always used to empower citizens and to give them the self responsibility for a huge piece of the democracy that they're part of. So when we get to good governance, always come back to first, you got to have unity and national security. If you're in a dictatorship, good governance means the dictator has overwhelming power and citizens do exactly what they're told. It's strange, but one of my grandsons, he's 22, just reached out about 3 weeks ago and said to me, Grandpa, I really want to understand um, the world better. He said, I'm at that point where I need to understand politics because I'm really struggling with where Canada is right now and how I fit in it. And so I gave him a couple of books to start, and we've had this ongoing discussion that we have nightly now through our Signal app, discussing pieces that he's read so far and where we're going. But I started him off with this idea of a circle. And at the top of the circle is you, standing alone in the wilderness, all alone. You have ultimate freedom. You choose every decision for yourself. You make every move. You decide where to go, when to go, what to eat, when to eat it. You're all alone. But that's very hard to survive against all of the elements of the wilderness. Now, some people can do it, and some people have done it very successfully, but it's rather a lonely existence as a human, and humans are social characters, so we tend to band together. But the minute you do, you are about to give up parts of your freedom to have a coalition with a second person, a fifth person, 100 people, 600 people, a nation. And so at the top of that circle is you all alone. At the bottom of that circle is a complete and total dictatorship. So a dictator who tells you every minute of every day exactly what you're going to do, when you're going to do it, and how you're going to do it. And so at the top of the circle, you can either walk left or you can walk right. And we get into this whole definition of right-wing extremists and left-wing extremists and all the way. But you're not really going left or right. You're just walking around that circle till you end up in exactly the same place. If you go too far right or too far left, you end up with a total dictatorship.
Mhm.
And so the further you go left, the sooner you come to the dictator, the sooner you go right, the sooner you get to a dictator. And the simplest idea or concept, as you go further left, government takes over more and more and more of your risk and responsibilities until you have the dictator, but it does so by becoming industry. So private sector decreases until it vanishes into government, and government runs everything. Think of Russia in 1985. Okay, every industry, every single action taken in the country was run by government. If you go right, you're increasing private sector, but at some point, the private sector starts to take over the government, and the government and the private sector become fused until you achieve the ultimate dictatorship. So each citizen in each country has to decide whether they want to walk left or walk right. But remember, if you go too far on either path, you end up in the same place. So governance is the key discussion around walking left, walking right, but more importantly, what is citizens' responsibility and how do they fit in that whole discussion? So we're going to talk about, in my opinion, the 6 elements that make up governance. And so I'll list them first, and then let's go back and talk about each one. And please jump in, stop me anytime when you want more or more meat, because I know I'm not the expert on this. Eva, you are. Okay. So as a citizen living in Canada for my lifespan, I'm 71 now. I've watched a whole bunch of things go into governance and to watch governance crumble. So let me list the 6 so that everybody understands where we're going with the whole thing. Number 1, democracy. you must have a secure election system. And we're going to talk about that in detail. What does that mean? A secure election system. Number two, it then produces elected officials. And so, what is the role and responsibility of elected officials in a democracy?
Mhm.
Number three, legislative process. How are laws passed that reflect the will of the people in a clear, transparent, open process? So, those are the first three. Then, in a democracy, you need a civil service to administer that, but only that which can't be done by the private sector, and which empowers the laws and the regulations that the elected officials pass and actually turn them into a plan and make them reality. Judicial system, a judicial system that holds elected officials to account, but also, far more importantly, enacts the laws passed through the legislative process. It doesn't make law, it enforces the laws that were passed by the people being represented by their elected officials, elected to do the things that the people ask them to do. So, a judicial system, and let's have a long discussion about that and where we are today. And finally, the sixth element, a completely independent news media.
Yeah.
And its job is to hold everybody accountable, the elected officials, the judiciary, the citizens of the country, and themselves. All right, so with those six elements as the backdrop, that's kind of the framework what I would like to talk about today is those six elements that define good governance in a democracy. Certainly, it's a entirely different discussion in a dictatorship. Right?
And and I'm just going to stop in that you started with saying I'm an expert in these topics, and I just want to say I don't think I am, and at this stage in Canada I don't think anybody is, because a lot of these entities are, we're trying to figure out what exactly they're doing, who they're accountable to, if anyone, what their purpose and goal is, because I'm scratching my head at some of them, like civil service, for example. Are they really serving the public right now? I'm not so sure. Independent media, almost made me laugh the last time I even heard those words referred to our national news media. So that's, it's not something I want to be laughing at. I want Canada to be taken seriously, but we have to take these different bodies incredibly seriously, and they just aren't right now. So I'll do what I can to provide insight, but I certainly don't think I'm an expert. And I feel a little bit Canadians are trying to figure that out right now as well, what everybody is supposed to be doing.
I I think Canadians are truly trying to figure that out right
Yeah.
now. And Eva, when I say you're an expert, I mean that sincerely. I believe you understand exactly what each of those six terms mean. The problem is we're not seeing it reflected in reality in our
Yeah.
country, which means we're either walking left or right heading for a dictatorship. And I believe it's happening intentionally. I believe that for the past decade, this government has intentionally forced that discussion to try and break good governance. I know they've broken unity. I know they've broken the seven elements of national security. I watched them do it. But at the same time, I believe they have intentionally tried to break good governance. And we're seeing it acted out in our streets and in our daily decision-making process. When governments believe that the response to COVID, the use of the 15 non-pharmaceutical interventions, which completely denied rights and freedoms, trampled on them, and our government officials applauded and slapped themselves on the back for doing due diligence to the point that they destroyed human rights and freedoms, it meant they lost the entire discussion and the understanding of what good governance in a democracy means, and
Yeah.
have slipped closer and closer, no matter which direction you're going, to dictatorship, but I believe done intentionally. And once they got away with it during COVID, we're now seeing it carried out routinely by parliaments at every order of government, municipal, provincial, territorial, and federal daily. So I think this discussion about governance and the six elements, in my opinion, the six that I've presented, and for anyone that's watching, one of the reasons I wrote the paper was to create discussion, not for Dave to give his opinion. Okay. It was so that it would spur a renewed interest in our country based on a clearly defined six national interests. And the six national interests simply give you a framework to say to a politician, okay, I want to talk to you about unity today and what you're doing to destroy it. And here's what I'm seeing. Now explain to me how you're going to make that better. Or
Yeah.
let's talk about good governance and what's happening to governance in our country. And let's talk about these six elements. If there's seven, great. Let's have that. That's the whole idea. Create discussion, discussion over dialogue, but create discussion so that people can become involved again in this great country, this wonderful country that I grew up in, that I hope to pass to my grandchildren in a better state than I left it. And right now, I've got a pretty short period of time to get it back to a state where I thought Canada was the best country in the world, and I proudly wore the maple leaf on my shoulder every day in countries all around the world. So, good governance to me, the six elements that define it, as we go through them, let's really rip them apart and talk about it so that people that don't spend their lives talking about this stuff suddenly go, oh, maybe that's what I'm seeing. And maybe I want to become more involved in that discussion or actually become part of the governance in our country.
Yeah, and we need that. Maybe one thing too, I'll say, because I've been saying this a bit more, and like you said, since COVID, we're just seeing it left, right, center. We're doing this for your safety. We're doing this to protect. I really don't want to hear that from somebody I've never met before.
No.
Number one, because it just sounds creepy and weird. But the way I've been describing it, maybe because I think a lot of people are very uncomfortable or almost fearful to hear the word dictatorship or communism, words like that, there's an immediate aversion to it. And so I've used the term nanny state because I think that maybe Canadians might be more comfortable with that word, just that if they see that the governance is babysitting us, being the nanny for adults, maybe that will help. And it doesn't have that connotation because they think, how could we be in a dictatorship? How could this be communism? We're in a democracy and the Liberal Party is in charge, not the Communist Party. So I would just I want to put that out to you, just maybe as we're having this conversation, because I know Canadians, that just immediately and I'd like your response actually too on that, because they just have an aversion when you say anything like communism or dictatorship in Canada. They won't even hear it.
And so, in my opinion, they have to hear it because it's happening to them.
Yeah.
And for those that weren't born when I was born in 1954 and who didn't live through the Cold War and, in fact, fight the Cold War like I did with 3 tours in Germany during the 70s, 80s, and ultimately at the end in the 90s, and see what had happened in the Cold War in Southeast Asia and in Africa, the horrible bloodshed that communism versus capitalism created, and the entire concept of what went on in the Soviet Union and within those Soviet Union countries and people that escaped out of the Soviet Union. You need to hear the word communism and you need to know what it means because it's happening in our country right now. And if you don't want to talk about it and stick your head in the sand, that's because I need to go back to my helicopter parenting versus bulldozer parenting. We have created a group of 40 to 50-year-olds who truly believe that no risk is theirs, that it all belongs to government. And the minute you believe that, you stop being a participant in your democracy. You start expecting the government to solve anything. So part of my aversion to the nanny state, and I totally understand why you use the term, and I agree that it's a trigger word because we're so weak as citizens that trigger words now stop us thinking. Well, it's time to get over trigger words and start to participate. But nanny state, if for any, I never had a nanny. I grew up in
Neither.
a steer house. But when I hear the word nanny, there's always a higher power than the nanny.
Mm,
Mom and dad who hired the nanny. Okay, so a nanny state implies that everything will be taken care of for you. But if you, at the end of the day, you really don't like it, you can appeal to someone bigger. Well, in this state, the someone bigger is acting as a dictator, not as a nanny. There is no one to appeal to past the prime minister who's putting these actions in place, to the premiers that locked us in our houses during COVID. They weren't nannies, they were dictators. And they were empowered because they got rid of the legislatures and stopped asking the people what they wanted. And they used that wonderful tool called fear. So, confidence and fear are two terms in a governance system for a democracy. Confidence, when I say confidence, I don't mean ignoring risks and threats. What I mean is you explain to your citizens that the new emerging threat can be handled. Here's how you're going to handle it. We have an actual written plan. Here's the plan. Give us feedback. You're participative. We've built this plan, but there could be holes in the plan. Please give us your feedback. You encourage feedback. You don't tell people that if they talk back to you, the police will come and arrest you. You say, I want your feedback. So, a confidence based system is you very openly create that plan with the public constantly, iteratively.
Hmm.
Then once you've got the plan, you publish it in a written form through the media so that everyone gets a copy and then knows exactly how to give feedback, and they can watch the plan unfold, and they have now confidence in that elected the right people, and that those people, if they stray from the path, can be unelected and replaced. And
Hmm.
the whole process is built so that every time you suggest something, you're not at fear for suggesting a change. And the whole confidence of the process is built because you are part of the plan. The opposite is fear. You tell people that something is so terrible, they aren't to think, they're to stay home and lock themselves in their house. They can't walk in a park. They can't do anything. They can't skate with their friends. They can't meet with their own family. Well, the intention of that is to break up the family unit that might have a discussion and then want to give some feedback. No, no, no. You're all individuals standing all alone at the top of that circle. And if you say anything, we'll come and get you.
Yeah.
Right. And so the whole idea of confidence versus fear, confidence empowers citizens, fear controls citizens. That's the point of the two differences. And at the top of the circle, what you're trying to do is show that they can be confident in the people they've elected and in the process and in everything to do with their governance. So as you walk left or right, you're giving up little bits of your freedom and you want to see back that it's fully and completely justified. I think it was Benjamin Franklin who said something to the effect, I'm not doing trying, anyone who'll give up even the smallest piece of essential freedom to manage risk deserves neither freedom nor the management of that risk. So the whole idea is you have to be able to accept risk to the maximum level you can and help your fellow citizens around you while you're doing it. But you expect them to accept risk, not to hide in their houses, not to be helicopter parented and bulldozer parent, where you were plucked out of any difficult situation or anyone who challenged you was removed because you were perfect. And
Yeah.
so we're at this point where it's up time for Canada to decide. The governance of our country has completely crumbled along with unity, national security, and in the subsequent discussions we'll have, our rights and freedoms, our ability to have a thriving economy, not a barely surviving economy, and all of the social well-being functions like healthcare, education. So we're working our way through it, but the governance model of a democracy is so fragile. I believe it was Churchill who said, once again, something to the effect of democracy is the worst form of government, other than every one we've tried so far.
Yeah.
So we know it's fragile. We know it's really messy. So we really need to have a discussion about the six elements that make up governance, what's happened to Canada, and how to make it better.
Yeah. And I think that this is something we've already talked about, and you started saying citizens' responsibility, and I just want to put it out here again because I think it's so important. Is I feel a little bit in Canada, Canadians forgot that it is actually our responsibility to be a part of the democracy. I think that they've taken a sit back and relax and watch approach and not being involved, and as a result, civil servants, I believe, and elected officials a little bit took advantage of that. And to some extent, I will give them a pass because sometimes citizens, unfortunately, are not engaging in the right way or don't understand how things work, which is why I decided to scrap advocating for anything at all and start educating, because only once we're educated and we understand the systems, we can advocate confidently in a democracy, and then that's where we get to really see awesome results. And I think a an accessible and quick change to the things that we want to see happen. But I think education and understanding that our role in democracy is just so
Correct.
important. So yeah.
Totally agree.
Okay, well, I'm excited to get on to these. The first one is, this is another trigger topic. How dare we say that our election system is compromised in a democracy? So excited to hear what you have to say on this. A little bit concerned, but excited.
Well, a secure election system it starts with a completely transparent process.
Yeah.
So the election system from start to finish must be 100% transparent, and
Uh-huh.
citizens must have faith based on that transparency. They've got to see every step of the process, how Elections Canada is formed, a body to supervise the election. Who exactly is involved? Are they partisan picks, or are they properly selected across all parties and all the schools of thought? An actual process that in a single day can use paper ballots to transparently count and then recount the same pieces of paper.
Mm-hmm.
If what we've seen with electronic systems, the whole idea of a transparent system has started to come into real question because people are really concerned what's happening inside the computers. We see countries like Poland who have done a full election with millions of people within a single day using paper systems where you have to have proof of ID before you're allowed to put your mark on a piece of paper. So, a clearly transparent process that is 100% independently monitored. So, the second bullet, complete independent monitoring. All right, so that it can't be partisan. And then at the end of the day, the results are unquestioned or unquestionable using methodologies agreed to by the public. Okay, so Canada needs to decide, is the system we're going to use first past the post? Is it by population by representation? Is it based on a geographical representation? Is it based on, there's so many different types of systems in democracies and all have their pros and cons. When I hear someone say, well, first past the post is terrible, I say, have you seen what happens in countries that do voting by representation by vote count? Countries like Germany that take 6 months to choose a leader after an election because they have to then get exactly the right distribution of people based on how many people voted for each little party, and a coalition government that comes together that lasts 6 months and then falls apart. Even a better analogy is Italy, sort of 1970 to 2000. They went through three governments a year because they used the system where it was representation by the number of people you got, and they had to cobble together governments. I remember watching a TV series on Denmark where it took them in one case, and it was based on the reality of what was happening in the Danish parliament. It took them a year to form a government. Well, if your country's under threat, can you really afford to take a year to form a government? Can you really? So for each yin, there's a yang. All
Mm-hmm.
right. And I'm not saying first past the post is the best system, but if you're going to throw that system out, you better have had a fulsome discussion, not a single man, the prime minister saying, we're going to change and we're going to this.
Yeah.
It has to be fully debated and then share it with the entire Canadian public. And I believe if you're going to change the system you use to elect your elected officials, it must be put to a referendum because it has to be 100% the public as a whole who chooses the form of government for their country, not even the elected representatives. I want to take it all the way back to the people.
So, with you on all of this, I just wanted to clarify first past the post because I think most people understand the concept, maybe haven't heard the term. So, in Canada, when we elect people, we elect only that person in our riding. And then if it's a conservative person that wins in our riding, and in another one, it's a liberal person, then whoever has the most liberal or conservative ridings in all of the country or the province, if it's a provincial election, then that the person that has the most, then that person becomes the premier or the prime minister. We don't vote in Canada, as I think we all know. We don't vote for our prime minister directly or the premier of our province. So that's what the first past the post means, just to clarify. And then just going back to your first point on secure elections and what Elections Canada is supposed to do. Very interesting is when there was a little bit of squabbling on the last election on ballots that went missing and things like that. I actually went to the Elections Canada site to learn a little bit more about what their job is, and I couldn't find anything about an open and transparent election is their responsibility, which really concerned me. And so just the fact that you're saying this, and I think this is another reminder for Canadians, is the very minimal things that we could be demanding from elected officials is complete transparency with public services like Elections Canada or elections in our provinces. Is we should be able to, like you said, see exactly who's on these boards, what's going on, how much they're getting paid. We're paying for all of this, and what it is that their jobs and responsibilities are. That should be completely transparent and open to the public. So just
So
wanted to.
maybe one more piece, just to
Yes.
add, because the transparency bit has become really fuzzy.
Mm-hmm.
And Canadians have gotten to the point where they demand more and more ease. Those that
Mm-hmm.
actually are going to vote. We have a terrible voting history in this country. So in our election system, one of the things I would love to put to a referendum is compulsory voting. That everyone must vote. If they choose not to vote, their taxes go up. The consequence of not voting and not participating in the democracy is you pay a little more tax. Okay?
And I don't know if I ever agreed with it but I like how you explained it as well, because I think there were but that's to say, why is it any different if you're speeding and you go over the limit, then you get fined?
Yep.
So you're not participating in the way that it's the established practice in the municipality to go under 50, or in Edmonton now it's under 40. So you're going at a snail's pace, in my opinion, and boom, you get a parking ticket. So why, if you're demanding that we participate in those rules and regulations, why not for the most important when we're actually electing people? So I think that if we start to frame the conversation that way, because I was always a little bit hesitant about it before, and like the more I think about it, it just kind of makes sense given that we pay fines all the time for other things.
You elect people and they tell you you can't walk in a provincial park.
Yeah.
If you're prepared to see people and snitch on people and give them a $25,000 fine because they exercise their right of freedom to walk on government land, i.e.,
Yeah.
citizens' land, then you have to participate in the democracy, or you don't get a right to complain about another citizen walking in a park and expressing their freedom. Okay, so number one, I think it should be compulsory to vote.
Mhm.
Second thing I'd love to see on the same referendum, we can do a whole referendum just on governance, right? And the second question is, should the National Voting Day be a national holiday? Therefore, no employer, no citizen has anything to do on voting day but vote.
Yeah.
And I don't want mail-in paper ballots, except for people forced to serve their country outside of their country on election day.
Uh-huh.
Soldiers that are deployed in the middle of Latvia should be able to vote by mail-in vote. But I don't think anyone else, this is just my opinion, I don't think anyone else, other than some very select categories, people with very severe disabilities, people in that are institutionalized, people, it's in person with ID at a polling booth, and it's a national day off, so you have all day to go and vote. You know, from 7:30 in the morning till 7:30 at night
Yeah.
in your riding. So number two, in-person voting, only in-person voting, except for a very clearly defined list of people who, for no fault of their own, can't get to a polling booth
Yeah.
on election day, which is a national holiday.
And on this one too, I just want to say it's not reinventing the wheel either. When I was doing research for my book, I looked into this, and so there are compulsory places or countries that have compulsory elections. One being Australia. And then I was also looking at national holidays. And what I did learn is that sometimes it was on a national holiday, sometimes it was on Saturday or Sunday, so the weekend when people have more time and don't have to take time off of work, whereas we generally have it on Monday. And I think it's like you said, like there's an opportunity to change these things and see what other countries are doing as well and what works the best.
Well,
One
many
little,
people still
Mhm.
have to work on Saturday, Sunday,
Yeah.
retail being a good example. So that's why I say everybody gets the day off. That would just be, I would put it to the people and say,
Mhm.
okay, so question one, question two. And so it has to be done in person, it has to be done. And then there is a requirement that the Elections Canada, whatever format, hand counts the paper ballots and must, without any, unless there's a severe impediment, like a tornado rips through a polling booth, must be able to report by midnight the hand count. So that means you have to keep all your writings to the size that paper ballots can be completely counted. And I put it to you again, Poland being the example, this is totally normal in
Yeah.
so many countries in the world. And yet somehow we've got to the point where we think we should be able to sit at home, click on our computer, not have to go outside. And then we wonder if the computer got it right, or in a mail in ballot, whether or not the return address was correct, or no, we need a secure election system that every Canadian is obliged to participate in.
Yeah.
And that implies that they need to educate themselves. If they know they have to vote, and that's what they've discovered in Australia when they put in compulsory voting, that people suddenly started to take more interest in who their local candidate was, in what the government vision for the future was, and so people became more engaged, now maybe to the 80% level. So let me talk about, the perfect system. In the army, I was always taught that any plan, remember, in the army we're always attacking an enemy is attacking us. You're never going to know everything. So timely is extremely important, and you always have a solution that's an 80% solution with options. Because if your 80% solution is clearly not the perfect solution, you can adjust because you've already built options into your plan. And so when I look at an election system, I'm looking for an 80% solution. And all the things that we've talked about so far, none of them are perfect. I know none of them. No democracy is perfect. Democracy is messy. And every one of the systems I've talked about can be corrupted. So that's when we get to later in good governance and we talk about the independent media and we talk about the judiciary. Those are overwatch systems on the election system. And so we need to have Canadians engaged not as snitch lines, but knowing that there is appropriate oversight to achieve the 80% solution.
Yeah.
And they have
100%.
confidence at the end of the election that the election was fair. It may not be the outcome they want, but that it was done transparently and fair.
Mm-hmm. 100%. Just again, such common sense. Like it just doesn't,
But
I don't,
unfortunately,
yeah.
I agree with you completely. It is common sense, and so why aren't we doing it?
Yeah, well, we could ponder on that, but
And so
let's just
that's
talk
why I
about
wrote the paper, to
solutions.
get Canadians to
Yeah.
understand each of the six national interests. And this one, if they want a democracy, they got to be really engaged in government,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. 100%. Agreed.
So let's go to bullet number 2, elected officials. Three ideas: accessible, transparent, accountable through recall. Okay.
Yeah.
So accessible to their constituents and must represent their constituents, not their party. So when we talk about elected officials, I want them to constantly be prepared to stand up and say, the people in my riding disagree with that, whether it's to the head of their party, whether it's to other people in the legislature, whether it's on committees, whether it's on, they're not there to be a trumpet for the party's position. They're there to represent the people that elected them. So they have to be accessible to the people, but on a reasonable amount of time, because they also must be transparent in the legislature. I believe, again, Dave's opinion, but not necessarily the right opinion, open to much debate, that Parliament should sit no less than 10 months of the year. I believe it should be based on a quarterly system, because in this country we have a break at December, a break in the summer, a break in the spring, and a break in the fall. And we should build it in that way. So there should be 4 sittings. But for the majority of the year, they should be in Parliament 4 days a week, 1 day back in their riding. And that should be fixed in our system. There
Mhm.
shouldn't be the ability to, as the Prime Minister attempted to do back in 2020, in a national emergency, parole Parliament or send all the MPs home to sit in their own homes for fear of a terrible virus. The exact time when Parliament should not have been dissolved and should have been debating every single issue. Is it correct to close schools? Is it correct to close small business? Is it correct to confine people to their houses? Should we close parks for skating? Should we not allow anyone to go outdoor? Those should have been debated viciously and vigorously in every parliament, whether it was federal, provincial, territorial, or municipal, through the entire pandemic. There should have been a demand to hear controversial and differing points of view. Instead, for almost 18 months, Parliament didn't sit at our provincial levels and at our federal level. And in many municipalities, it was almost 2 years.
Yeah.
Things like school boards, all of these systems where elected officials should be accountable to the people, they should be meeting all year round. I look at other jurisdictions in the world, they don't only sit for a spring session and a fall session that are less than 3 months long combined. This is
Yeah.
ridiculous. Parliament is there to make the legislation that reflects the will of the people, and they must be accountable and meeting face to face with people who disagree with them. Other parties have the committees in full debate and fully televised so that people can see that the people they elected are actually representing their point of view, not the parties. And so when we get to the legislative process in a minute, I believe every vote should be a free vote except the budget.
And one thing I would add to the elected representatives, and it's not all of them, but I do find that some are clearly tied to the party, but some I find are social justice warriors of their own cause. So no longer representing obviously a variety of people and making outlandish statements that they believe in, but at the same time disregarding or disparaging some of their own citizens.
Correct.
And that one I find really uncomfortable and unfortunate, because that's causing a lot of the trust issues, the breakup with citizens not trusting elected officials because they're being disparaged in that way or disregarded in that way. I think elected officials need to be reminded that they represent everyone, even the unsavory ones, even the ones they don't agree with, even people in prison have the ability to vote.
Yep. And so when you walk into Parliament wearing a scarf or a pin or a bandana or a flag that isn't just Canada, you are expressing your personal opinion, not that of the people who elected you.
Yeah.
And that must cease. The only apparel that should be allowed in any parliament, federal, provincial, territorial, or municipal, is that of the country, the municipality, or the province and territory. You should not be adorned with a religious accoutrement, a racial accoutrement, a gender accoutrement. You are there to express the will of your entire constituency in your riding,
Yeah.
many of whom take offense at the emblem you're wearing or believe that you now understand only their point of view and
Yeah.
therefore everyone else, they can do harm to everyone else in that riding because you clearly agree with them. This whole idea is you're not there as the individual, you're there to represent your riding. And so
Yeah.
elected officials have to be accessible, transparent, and accountable through recall. So when they do one of these things, we don't have to wait 4 years for the next election. If
Mhm.
an MP, an MLA, an MPP, or a councillor or a mayor are doing things which do not reflect the will of their riding, there must be an achievable, not easy, but achievable recall mechanism. And so elected officials must know that when they take actions that aren't in keeping with the people who elected them, they have the potential to be removed
Yeah.
because it's a great paying job, over $200,000 a year to go and sit for maybe, 4 months of the year in Ottawa and the other time do whatever you really feel like, because we're certainly not see them walking door to door in their ridings every day with that they're supposedly at home talking to the people. So it, when you don't perform on behalf of the people that elected you, there must be an achievable, not easy, but achievable method to recall that individual and demand an immediate by-election to replace them.
Yeah. 100% agree. It just makes total sense.
And so some of these things that we're talking about do exist, but some of them don't. So the whole
Yeah.
recall mechanism, and I mean not by a confidence vote, I mean
Yeah.
individuals. And so we need to have this discussion about governance in our country. Have we got it right? I don't think so. I think there's pieces that we need to legislate into existence to
Uh-huh.
make it better. Democracies evolve. Let's have the discussion. But right now there is no discussion, and
Agreed.
certainly recall. Politicians don't want to have a discussion about recall because it's them we're going to recall.
Yes. Yeah. And they don't want to make it too easy because they're the ones that are going to make the legislation. So I've been saying this for so often. It's citizens that have to demand it. And the best example would have been Justin Trudeau being in power more than 8 years. Like, or no, sorry, that one is on terms, which we didn't even talk about.
Yep.
But term limits also is another one that is worth having at least a discussion about in this country so that we're having these conversations and talking about the pros and cons of recall legislation, of term limits, but we're not even there. At the moment you want to say something, oh, let's investigate this, let's do better here. How? Don't be such a whiner. Why are you such a complainer? Leave the country then. Those are some of the responses you get for engaging in democracy in
Exactly.
Canada.
People who have actually taken the time to understand the country are being told to leave the country.
Yeah, yeah,
So
nonsense.
term limits, that's a good because I see it attached to the judiciary as well as the elected officials. So kind of an overarching discussion. But let's start it here.
Yeah,
Term limits to me, the number of times you can be reelected should be defined because there comes a point in time where people just revote someone in because of name recognition rather than anything to do with what they stand for. And there comes a point in time when even if they've done a decent job, it's time for fresh ideas and for new relationships to be built. And then the whole discussion is, can they run again later? Can we? What you don't want is the Putin story where he steps down for one 8-year term, puts his puppet in place for 8 years and then comes back for another 16 years, right? We want to make, if term limits are going to be done, the reason behind them has to be discussed, understood, agreed to. And then we need to make them correct and achievable. And this whole idea of a pension after 8 years and all the rest of it in Parliament, well, we need to have a whole discussion about what are the salary benefit and everything for elected officials. But leave that piece aside. Term limits, to me, at most, and I mean really at most, is 12 years. And I'm really pushed to get there. But to me, I believe that each generation coming up should be inspired to want to replace those going out.
Yeah.
And to me, a perfect politician, and again, this is just Dave's opinion, is someone between the age of 35 and 55. And why do I say that? Eva, we've had the discussion about what makes a good leader: ethically fit, physically fit so your body doesn't collapse in the middle of when you need it most, intellectually fit, so constantly upgrading your knowledge, constantly upgrading your skill in whatever you do, and then the courage, so epic process, the courage to apply the first three. And so someone between 35 and 55 normally has had the time to develop their intellect. They've become a master at something, whether it's a private sector trade, a private sector profession, a different form of government, a different NGOs, whatever. But they've had that formation because the knowledge side, I was an instructor and then a commandant of a school in my life in the Army. And we taught two things: knowledge and skill. Knowledge to understand what it was you were to do. And then we repeatedly practiced it over and over and over to give you the basic skill before we launched you out. I taught young officers before we launched you out to destroy the lives of privates and corporals. So at least you had a moderate skill ability. So I believe it took till 35 to achieve a master tradesman, a master, an officer in the rank of major, someone who was truly capable of their profession, which they then would bring to Parliament, whether it was municipal, provincial, territorial, or federal. So
Uh-huh.
35 sort of entry level, and 55. By 55, I'm sorry, there used to be a reason why in the Army the compulsory retirement age was 55, because physically you get to the point where you can't sustain your actions to the degree you could at 35. All right. And so the ethically fit is a challenge for your whole life. But the physically fit, you start to deteriorate. Intellectually fit, you're not ready yet. And then you need to pick people with the courage to use them. So I always thought 35 to 55. And so when I see a leader in countries that are over the age of 70, you know they're going to have medical issues and that they may fail in the middle of a crisis. You can't have that as the leaders of your country, even if it's an extended debate that goes well past midnight.
Yeah.
You saw me after midnight. I'm not very good. So I recognize in my own body. So that's why I think term limits, who we elect, how we define what elected officials should and could be. There's always got to be rules for exceptions, okay? For that incredibly bright person or that person who is so capable into their 90s that maybe there's but when Roosevelt died before the end of World War II, it was because he and his party wanted to prop him up till the end of the war, and terrible decisions were made in the last 6 months of the World War II, many of them initiated by a dwindling, diminished president of the United States. We can't allow leaders of our country, of our province or territory, or of our municipality to be in a diminished state. We need them
Hmm.
Top Gun every day,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
then thank them very much, reward them appropriately, and treat them like we should be treating veterans of the military, with honor and distinction for the rest of their life for participating in our democracy. So
Yeah.
elected officials is a huge area for discussion, but term limits are definitely something that we could spend, you and I and a small group could just spend a whole week talking about and hearing the pros and cons of all the things I've said, the things you believe, the things that everyone get in that room and say, okay, what is a term limit and why? You have to fight
Mhm.
for why you think it's that.
Yeah. Totally agree. It was just such an interesting discussion, and it gets people more on board with this democracy too. If we're not participating in the democracy, then you lose trust in it,
Yep.
and then obviously the people in charge take advantage because we're not involved. So I've always been saying, what's the chicken? It's the chicken and the egg scenario.
And the
Citizens have
older
to show,
people that
yeah,
are advisors, they're not the
yeah,
doers anymore, right?
yeah. Good point. Yeah, yes, yeah.
You don't throw them out. You
No,
listen to their wisdom, like we used to do in our ancient cultures, or even in our family households, because family is such a huge part of our democracy, and we'll
yeah,
get to that in rights and freedoms. But the family unit. When I lived in Germany 3 times, we lived out on a little farm, and our next door neighbors were this wonderful family where there was the 80-year-old Oma living with the mom and dad, her children, who were raising their children, and some of their children started to have the great grandchildren, right? All living in one house. So
yeah,
each person in that house, as they got older, the tasks and duties fell to the generation below, and they took on the ones that had been the Oma before them, right? And so everybody shuffled up in their duties, but they became age appropriate. And
yeah,
always the elder was in the house to talk to the grandchildren,
yeah,
right? Because the parents were out earning the money, were out there, but every day when the little ones were growing up, Omo had them in the backyard teaching them how to garden, teaching them how to feed the chickens, how to look after the cow, how to, you know, so that ancestral knowledge got passed down. We don't do that anymore. The minute someone hits 55, they're shipped off to the old folks center, right? And the family unit is completely different. So we need to build into our elected system a method to bring age of experience and knowledge, wisdom into the discussion without allowing or forcing them to be the actual leaders when physically and emotionally it gets harder and harder and harder for someone over the age of 55.
yeah. Again, makes perfect sense.
Okay. So let's go to legislative process, the third bullet. It has to be transparent, it has to be timely. So those are my two little bullets, but that whole thing needs to be pulled apart. Legislation, in my opinion, has to be never rushed. And I know some people want to have instant solutions to big problems, but we need to actually have the 3 readings for a reason. It needs to go to committees with appropriate time. The committees must be open and transparent and fully reporting to the public, not the party and not just the parliament, but the people of the country need to see the discussion that's happening inside. And so that whole legislative process, as it works through, because a piece of legislation needs to be able to stand the test of time. It can't be something for the spur of the moment. It can't be something for a small single issue. It needs to be defined properly. But when you write legislation, I was in the civil service after I got out of the army. And so when politicians pass a piece of legislation, they occasionally are involved in the regulation that falls out of it. What they then wash their hands of is the implementation. Parliament, though, in Canada has a completely second role, which is to resource the enactment of legislation. And so when they just wash their hands of it and say, all done, nothing happens because they never gave the resources to write the plan. Because after the regulation, then you actually have to write a plan how you're going to implement every piece of that regulation with
Hmm.
courses open, presented back to the elected officials that they rarely want to hear. They just say, get on with it. And so they've empowered the civil service with things they should never have empowered them with. When you write a plan, when counterterrorism happened, I'll give you a little example. I was made head of counterterrorism at crisis management counterterrorism in Alberta, basically on September the 12th, 2001. And one of the things in my process I constantly did, I reported back to the Task Force on Security, which was 10 ministers, but ultimately then the ministers presented it to the Premier at the time was Ralph Klein. And so each step of the process, I did a level 3, which is a basically framed costed estimate. And then I did the level 5, which was a full detailed breakout of a plan. each time it ultimately ended up back to the premier to say yes or no. And that task force was fully engaged. We briefed them weekly at the start, then monthly, all the way through this process for 2 years. That's an elected government that was doing its job. What we see now is they write this chunk of legislation, hand it off to the civil service, and vanish into the distance. And then they wonder why 5 years later none of it ever happened, because they didn't. There's 6 7 resources that make up all of life: people, infrastructure, money, supplies, equipment, publications, and training, right? And without all of those pieces, none of it happened. And so what we need is a legislative process that's linked to results. So when you write a piece of legislation, there has to be what are called performance indicators. And at the end of the day, you have to do validation. So it's a 5 step process: analysis leading to legislation, then evaluation, an actual design done, reported back to government, a design that then has even more subdivided reportables, which then you do implementation and you supervise the implementation. Then the 5th step is evaluation. And evaluation is, did you actually implement what you designed? Okay. So you go back to step 2. Evaluation goes back to step 2, design. And then at the end of the day, on an annual basis, there should be a report to Parliament, i.e., the people that are paying for this, that says, here's the performance indicator that you told me you were going to measure. Here's the measurement. So that's called a validation. And validation is, did the legislation do what you thought it would do?
Right.
Because if it doesn't, you need new legislation. So it's
Yeah.
the 5 steps, and we're not seeing that in our legislative process.
Yeah. And that's across the board. We're not seeing any of that. Yeah.
Provincial, territorial, municipal, federal, elected officials. The other thing that I worked both sides of the board for quite a long time in my life, both in uniform and out of uniform, and the whole linkage between government and the people is different in our two countries, right? And this ability to go back, but completely different when you talk about a congressperson in the U.S. House of Representatives. They have absolutely no responsibility for delivery. There's secretaries that report
Uh,
to the president that do delivery. We don't have that system. In Canada, a minister runs a department. So when the legislation is passed, it should be handed to the minister with the performance indicators defined in the legislation, and that minister should report back to all of Parliament and the Canadian public on each piece of the legislation they're accountable
mhm.
for, not just the new stuff, the hundreds of bills and acts that we have that are currently being administered by our civil service. And the civil service shouldn't be allowed to define the validation process. That should be defined in the legislation. They simply have to report to the requirement, right? And so
Yeah.
if it's a new system, if it's a project, you do design and you have to have the evaluation that what you paid for, you actually put in place. Let's use ArriveCan as an example. We decided that we needed to monitor people coming back into our country. And so, somewhere in the legislation, we decided that we had the right to inflict this on Canadians. We then said in the design phase that we would build ArriveCan, a software tool that Canadians would be mandatory for Canadians to use to report come back. There was an implementation phase, and Parliament just walked away.
Yeah.
And millions of dollars were poured into something that never worked, that never met any design criteria. There was never an evaluation of the system other than Canadians bitching their faces off, quite correctly. No one in Parliament ever checked to see if what was designed was
Yeah.
implemented, let alone the validation report back to Parliament. Did it actually make Canada safer? And the answer was obviously no.
And that was all deferred to a third party, independent, so not accountable to the people, getting paid by the people. So a terribly broken system. And very interesting comparison to the United States with secretaries, where we're seeing these secretaries all the time talking about what they're doing, how they're implementing the president's proclamations and orders, and what it is they're doing with the legislators. So, or in the legislation. So very interesting. And
Compare that to our
what a
parliament that
hold!
said
What a
we were
hold!
going to remove all provincial trade barriers by July 1st. Our federal government said it.
Yeah,
Okay. So, first of all, there was no legislative process. That was a dictator making an announcement. There was no parliament. It was never discussed in parliament. It was
yeah,
never debated whether or not it was achievable, whether it was the role of the federal government at all.
right.
So, none of the things that we've talked up to till now were done, and intentionally done with no feedback, no validation system or evaluation system, because none of it's been achieved and no one wants to talk about it.
Mhm.
So the entire thing that we've been talking about, there are golden examples of legislative process being completely ignored in this country. When you don't even have a budget, it's impossible to link it to legislation, which then is appropriately funded. How do you know that any proclamation that's signed like an executive order, and our prime minister has no right to sign executive orders? It's Parliament that does everything in this country, not the
Mhm.
prime minister. And yet, there is absolutely no accountability for these proclamations because there's no budget line item that says this was even resourced in any manner to do a design to then be able to evaluate.
Yeah.
We're in a place where these basic fundamentals that we're talking about, legislative process that's transparent and timely. Canadians should see there should be no such thing as an omnibus bill. Every piece of legislation should be a standalone that can be debated and talked about with the Canadian public. The purpose, when I redesigned the paper for how to rebuild the Canadian forces, unfit for duty, published on C2C Journal, the number one element of restoring an operable Canadian forces is to define the purpose. Every piece of legislation should have a clearly defined purpose, which is part of the 25-year vision. I want to keep linking back to the government has to say where they think we're going to get to in 25
Yeah.
years. And therefore, every piece of legislation has to link to that vision. If it doesn't, it's not part of this term until you
Yeah.
define that in your next 25-year vision, because you simply there's only so much time, there's only so much money. That's where we're going. Every single decision, every piece of legislation should be debated on, will this get us there in the
Yeah.
right amount of time and in a cost-effective manner? And is it what people want? The purpose must be clearly defined.
And I was just going to add, because you mentioned it and then we skipped over it, was every elected official should be able to vote independently outside of their party. And so you just mentioned having each piece of legislation separately, which I also think is incredibly healthy. And we should be having this conversation. 20 years ago in Alberta, I know that certainly was the case. You didn't have to vote with what your party said, and things have really changed in Canada, and I don't think in a good way. So I think that needs to come back, and people should be able to express their different views and opinions and
So
concerns.
let's nail that. I totally agree. Sorry, I skipped over that. My bad. I believe that if you have legislation that's defined on a single topic, that gives every backbencher, every frontbencher the opportunity to express by their vote whether or not the people that they're representing agree with that legislation and the purpose of it. And
Yeah,
and when we get it wrong, it doesn't bring the government down. It just says, send it back to committee. We got it
yeah,
wrong. Or do we need that piece of legislation at all? Or do we need to start from scratch? Right?
yeah,
Because if you get a let's say you get a 45% vote, well, it means you got chunks of it right. If you get a
yeah,
20% vote, it means throw it out, start with a clean sheet of paper. You got it wrong, right?
yeah,
And it's got to be when they go back on their Fridays, and remember, I'm still working on my quarter system. They get time at home for like a 2-week period. they talk to the people and they get told, what the hell are you doing?
Yeah.
Because with an independent media, all of this will be disclosed to the public and you will know what this new piece of legislation is and what the purpose of it is. And the people that are writing say, not for us, wrong flavor, doesn't
Yeah.
fit here. Okay.
Yeah. Sounds like a responsible government that we were
Isn't
promised.
that what democracy is all about?
You think. Civil service.
All right, let's go to the
Next
civil
one.
service because I know this is a contentious issue, and I served in the civil service for 5 years after I got out of the army, and was very proud to do so. And if you want to really stretch the analogy, the army really is a civil service for the people of our country too, right?
Yeah.
It's to defend our country, so kind of one of the biggest tasks. But
I don't think it's a stretch. I think it
it's
fits
part
the
of
bill.
public service, right?
Yeah.
And so I think it's time to have a complete rethink on the civil service. And
Uh-huh.
so let me give you the four bullets and then let's really drill down. So they have to be professional. And being in the civil service should be an honored profession. Number two, they have to be accountable, not just to Parliament, but to the people of Canada. They
Uh-huh.
are there to serve Canadians, whether you're municipal civil service, provincial, territorial, or federal. So
Uh-huh.
accountable. Minimum size. Every single, we used to call them FTEs, full-time employees, has to be fully justified. If you can't write the terms of reference, and I saw so many departments in my time in government looking at the federal government and looking, it takes too long to write terms of reference for that position. Well, then you don't need the position. If you can't define in bullet form exactly what that person does each day with a measurable to ensure that they're achieving it, then you don't need the position. If you
Uh-huh.
can't write TOR, terms of reference, for every position in the civil service, it's got to go. And you should never be allowed to use a contractor. If the job is important enough to do for the continuing operation of our country, it's a full-time paid employee. If it's a very short-term project, that's the only time you can justify the use of a contractor, and there must be a fixed date for expiry. And you should not be allowed to go past that date without massive, really hard justification.
Yeah.
Okay. So projects, but program administration, FTEs, full-time employee, that is a professional. So minimum size, and you have to justify every position. And I believe it should be done at least every 4 years, but I believe it's probably should be done each year.
Uh-huh.
Does this position still need to exist? And if you want another position, because there's a new requirement from legislation passed by government, it comes with the funding for that FTE. You don't have to justify the FTE. The actual legislation comes with the funding and why it must be an FTE.
Yeah.
Okay. So you link it back that way. And then effective and efficient. And to do that, as we go back to legislation, as we go back to regulation, there must be performance indicators that link directly to an annual validation process. There must be performance indicators to make sure you're actually implementing what you told government you're going to implement. So two steps, back to design, back to legislation, back to analysis. And so without that complete ability, you have no way of knowing if it's effective and efficient. So we
Uh-huh.
need to put in place a civil service that is very proud to serve the people of Canada, and that the people of Canada are very proud to know members of their civil service, and that they sit and have coffee with them in the coffee shop and talk to people and, oh, what's going on in government today, that it's an interesting job, that it's a meaningful job, but that it is right size, which means it is the minimum size possible. When we get to a point, and the statistics were just released about 3 weeks ago, where the civil service and private sector employees are the same size in our country, we are so far out of whack. And so sorry to hate to use the word, you've started to achieve communism. My basic definition of communism, and nobody's ever challenged me on it, I use it frequently, is when 50.1% of the population relies on government salary monthly in order to live. So that's federal,
Yep.
provincial, territorial, municipal, all your policing agencies, all your fire agencies, all your NGOs that are funded directly. When you add those up, if you achieve 50.1%, you have achieved communism, because now everybody doesn't want to remove the government because it might cost them their salary.
Yeah. And I think that's a very fair and reasonable definition because it is state sponsored pay, right? It's state sponsored um, employment, sustenance. So that totally makes sense because that's essentially what communism is that the state is running the country. And when it's over 50, like it doesn't have to be this person. In fact, it isn't a person, it is the state. And so I think that
When the
is
wall came down
probably
in
the thing.
Germany, I
Yeah.
did an extensive tour in East Germany. It was a German army tour, and I was allowed to tag along. We did 3 weeks, and I met people from DDR, the former East Germany, who told me, the wall's down now. It's 4 years later. At least under communism, everybody had a job. And I smiled and I said, "So what was your job?" "Well, I was the assistant to the assistant to." I said, "And well, so what did you do every day?" "Well, I went to work at about 9 o'clock, and I came home at noon, and my job was to count the number of paychecks that had been delivered through our payroll system." And I said, "But you were done by noon." "Oh, yes." And I said, "And you were paid a salary?" "Oh, yes." "Were you paid a daily salary for 3 hours work?" "Oh, yes." Everybody in Germany had a job. I went, and that's why we bulldozed every manufacturing plant in East Germany to the ground and rebuilt them, because none of them could compete in the real world.
Yeah.
Everybody had a job. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, we're seeing our civil service get bigger and bigger and bigger, and contractors latching onto it and getting paid, and we get arrive Ken.
Yeah.
Okay. And it's not a single
Eh,
isolated bad example. There's many of them. So
the,
then we get into, and I know we're talking civil service, but I'll just take it a little aside. We get into universal basic income, and I can't stand that conversation.
Well, and what I just wanted to say is I get the resistance because, and then this goes back to fear and confidence. People want to justify their jobs. They want to feel like they're, being productive in society. And I'm going to put it out there. Unfortunately, I don't know too many people that work in the civil service that have that spirit that you used to have, talking about how proud you were. Like, it's hard to find somebody that, like you said, will sit down with you at a coffee shop and be like, this is what I'm doing. Instead, it's like, I go to work, I hate my job, doing it for the pension. And when I hear that, it's very not just for me, for that person, for the country, for the public sector, for the citizens that it's supposed to be helping. Like, it's not in my spirit, which is why I do what I do. Like, I just wouldn't be able to do that. But I get the resistance because it's connected to them so much and they want to defend it. And then there's the fear.
Well,
So maybe we
fear
should
of
talk
loss
about
of
that.
salary rather than fear of not contributing.
Say that one more time, sir.
Fear of loss of salary
Yeah.
rather than fear of not contributing.
Uh,
Not
yeah.
contributing to Canadian society. They're more afraid of losing their salary than going out and finding a new job where they
Yeah.
feel fulfilled.
Yeah.
And
It
and
just
so
it's that
we got to
basic.
have that discussion at a very
Yeah.
high level and then boil it down. And
Yeah.
you know how Ralph Klein cut the civil service in Alberta by 2/3 in 5 years was brutal. In many cases, the wrong way. But at the end of the day, he rebuilt a far leaner, more competent civil service by the end of 10 years. And the things that got wrong got put back, but sometimes the whole really hurt some people in the middle. But people would arrive. I wasn't there. I joined the civil service in 2000 when I got out of the army. But people would just arrive and complete sections had pink slips on their desk. Well, that's probably the wrong way. You need to actually decide if any of the functions that were being done in that complete department were of value to the citizens of Alberta rather than just to try and achieve a magic
Yeah.
budget number, right?
Or-
Anyhow, there's ways to do this that are far more professional, but it's not by adding 50% to the civil service in under 10 years. That's the wrong way.
Yeah.
But that was done intentionally to put more people on salary to create the resistance to change in government. And I put it to you, they would then rejig ridings to put civil servants into certain ridings to make sure that certain people don't get elected. Right?
Yeah.
So everything's linked at the highest level looking down. We need to rebuild it and we need to rethink how to justify the civil service. And I think we've had that discussion, but it needs to be professional, accountable, minimum sized, effective, and efficient. And we need to link the civil service to the legislation. If
Yeah.
you can't, with performance indicators that can be validated annually, then obviously you have a section or a group that has no purpose
Yeah.
if it's not linked to what the government is doing on behalf of a request from the people of Canada.
Right. Again, super common sense, makes sense to me. I would implement it all.
So let's go to Eva, the judicial system.
Sure.
So three bullets and then a very detailed discussion. Sorry, I just got to take a sip of coffee. 3 bullets. Number 1, key, independent. Number 2, timely. Number 3, transparent.
Yeah.
And so the independence of our judicial system is not clean because we know they're politically appointed. And so I look at the US with their elected system for the judiciary. At some orders of government. I look at other countries' systems. For every yin, there's a yang. And so if you use an elected system and they're replaced every 4 years, you have judges that are more interested in getting reelected than they are in terms of administering the law in a clear and transparent manner. And so you got to weigh that off against permanently in placed judges that basically time out at 75. There's got to be a balance, but there's got to be a way to recall judges, right? When a judge clearly is using politics rather than the law, there's got to be a way to call them out as well. Um, when decisions are made that are obviously not in keeping with the will of the people. I look at the administration of the catch and release system in our country. I look at people getting more time for political activism than they get for rape and murder. We're disconnecting from the Canadian public who are clearly in opposition and disagreeing. And I don't mean about the freedom convoy. I mean disagreeing with how we're treating mass murderers in our society and allowing them back onto our streets, and how we're watching illegal protests that when the police arrest them, the judge releases them. So there's got to be some way that the judges can be independent, but not disengaged from the public that they were put in place to represent. The laws, when a law comes up for the first time or repeatedly in front of a judge, judges, and the judges, as we know in your system, the common law and all the rest of that, and it's based on precedent. When precedents are ignored, there's got to be a way to call the judge out. And when we get to the point where judges believe it's their job to write law rather than to send an unclear law back to Parliament. A judge, when they go, I can't rule on this because to me, I'm going to interpret the law. The minute I hear that word interpret the law, stop. The law goes back to the legislature, whichever order of government created the law, to be redrafted and rewritten to be unambiguous. Because judges' job is to apply the law, in my opinion, not to interpret the law. The law is based on precedents, and if it's a new law, when it gets to the point where they believe that they simply don't have a clear enough understanding, it goes back to Parliament.
Interesting. So this is maybe an area that we won't agree with entirely, but maybe we will through a discussion. But so I'd never heard the recall idea. So as soon as you said that, I was like, ooh, taking a step back. Interesting. But one thing to comment on is the system that you're kind of looking for. I would just suggest that that's the appeal system. So at the lower level, if the judge went too far or didn't apply the law correctly or the facts, then it could appeal it to the higher court. And that's what the higher court's role is.
And so in
Where
your higher court is the problem. How do you recall them?
Right. So this is where I've had, and I don't have the answer either. What I do like in the American system is, at least on the top court, we learn, even as Canadians, so much about nominees to the Supreme Court. There's an open hearing where senators get to ask questions and you hear their responses. In Canada, we don't have anything like that. So you get, unless you know the judges, which lawyers may know some of the judges, especially if they come from your province, but most Canadians have no opportunity to get to know these judges. They don't have an opportunity for their elected officials to test the boundaries of the judges. So for me, even that transparent, open discussion between senators, and I think it's senators in the United States, asking questions of nominees to the Supreme Court, I think that's already an interesting step that Canada can implement. And that's just being open, that's being transparent, showing the public who these people are. So there's a bit more confidence in the public. And at the same time, those top judges have to show the public who they are. And I think they're under oath
Totally
there as well.
agree. And so, and I would make the difference in Canada at the for provincially appointed judges. I believe it should be done in the provincial legislature, and for federally appointed
Mm.
judges, I believe that interrogation should be done by the legislature, committee of legislature, rather than the Senate. We can have a whole discussion
Oh,
about the
yeah.
purpose of the Senate later, but I believe it should be to the people, the representatives of the people, rather than the Senate, which is a political
Oh, yeah.
appointment. And so
Yeah.
I totally agree. That way, for provincial judges and for federal judges,
Yeah.
they, at least when appointed, have to stand the test to defend their history and
Yeah.
give people a true flavor. And I don't know how you would do it. Again, isn't my area, but an intentional forced balancing system in terms of left and right thinking in our country so that we end up with a fierce debate amongst judges on rulings, right?
Yeah.
And so you don't end up with all the judges being appointed in a 12-year period by a certain government with a certain flavor, and it takes another 12 years for them to die off to be replaced to get a balance back. Because I want my judges to represent all the flavors of my country in balance, not with only one view. So I love the idea of having each judge, as they come forward through a process, to defend their past, to defend their history, and so people know exactly what flavor, then some kind of a balancing system to ensure that we don't end up with a system where they will encourage the replacement of an existing government.
Well, and so the other thing I'll say on that is I think that is the balancing of elected officials. So when the electorate is getting it right and they're choosing or I can't even say getting it right because that is who they're choosing, they are getting it
Correct.
right, then it's whoever's in charge gets to pick. So it's up to the electorate, in my view, if they're educated and understand, then that balance will naturally happen. And shame on some conservative leaders who didn't appoint more people to these positions when there was availability. So, they shot themselves in the foot rather than making those appointments. So you can't blame.
But but it shouldn't
Yes.
be the prime minister picking judges.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, and I think many Canadians don't know that, so we should probably explain it. Is even provincial judges in like different this superior courts in Canada provincially are appointed by the federal government. And I do think that I don't know where that came from. I have to look back at the Constitution. Obviously, that's where it would come from, but where in the Constitution? So that doesn't make sense. And what's even weirder, I believe, and I'm 95% sure on this, the province pays for the provincial judges that the federal government elects. On the low level provincial court, which is like traffic court and those kind of things, that's provincially appointed. But, yeah, this is getting a little bit
The whole
silly
idea
when yeah,
is
I'm
we
with
need
you.
to have an independent judicial system, and the question is how do we ensure that that is the case? Because certainly the court rulings that are occurring in very serious crimes in our countries do not seem at this time and for the past 10 years have not been expressing the will of the people of Canada, in my
Yeah.
opinion.
But that would be criminal law too, and that's the criminal law is enacted by the federal government.
And
So
the
yeah, that
laws are clear, they're
yeah.
not being
Yeah.
enforced.
Yeah.
And so police
100%.
have given up,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Not good.
So timely and transparent. By timely, I when you have a rapist who is released with no conditions because the trial took more than 2 or 3 years to come to trial, you have a system that is broken.
Yeah.
Because to me, justice, it's the old saying, justice must not only be done, it must be seen to be done. And in the Army, as a commanding officer, I had some pretty extraordinary powers of punishment, including dismissal with disgrace from the Canadian Forces. I could recommend it, and CO's recommendations were 99.9% of the time enforced by the CDS. So, and without review, I could give 90 days hard labor, and 90 days hard labor means just that. In the Edmonton detention barracks or in the Balcarchy detention barracks, it's not a really pretty place to go, right? And your life for 90 days was living hell. So, but you had to be timely, and you had to soldiers watch. And I have always used this analogy that 80% of people, all citizens, are basically fundamentally good. They want to work, they want to raise a family, they want to be left alone. They're just good people. 5% of our population is pure evil, and evil exists. They truly are evil. That 15% that I've missed out, and I watched this in my career in the Army. This is based on observation over 27 years. And remember, the Army is a select group of citizens, and probably in some cases a little better, in some cases a little worse. But that 5% that are evil, if they get away with what they're doing, that 15% that I haven't talked about slides towards them, and you have a unit that has terrible morale. But if senior leadership, and it's leadership's job, not citizens to rat think, leadership to observe and catch, if leadership does its job, finds and fixes the 5%, and it never ends because as fast as you fix one, a new one shows up in your unit. So it's this constant, your job is to fix them. The 15% slides back with the 80% and become performing citizens again. But you've got
Uh-huh.
to fix and find. So when I see premiers of provinces banning hiking in a park, it's because as a leadership, they realize that they have lost the ability to find the arsonists. That's their job. It's not
Yeah.
citizens' job. Yeah, citizens
Uh,
are there to help and monitor, but they're not there to be the snitches. When I was the CO, I never expected a soldier to report on another soldier. I expected the sergeants and warrants and lieutenants and captains to do their freaking job, to be on the
yeah,
floor, to be out there in the woods, to be in the trenches and identify the 5%. And then to actually have the courage to lay charges and process them to me. And then
yeah,
I did my job and in many cases threw them out of the Canadian Forces with a very big caveat. Dismissal with disgrace says to any future employer, this is not a good citizen that is now
yeah,
applying for a job. It's up to employers to ask for the military record, but it's right there in bold, right? So leadership has to do their job, and the judicial system has to be timely, but it has to be transparent, and it has to say, if you're bad, you're not getting out of prison.
yeah,
You can appeal it, but what you did is so heinous, you're in the 5%. And you know what happens? The number of criminals decreases because when justice is not only done, it's seen to be done, the 15% goes, not worth it. And
yeah,
they slide back.
yeah, yeah. And on the like, I don't do criminal law, but on the judicial system and like prison sentences and jail system, that's a whole other discussion too. That
And
is
so it's
just
one that
so
Canadians need to be engaged in, right?
yeah,
And that's
agreed.
that's the whole purpose of the paper that I wrote
Yeah,
and the discussions that you and I are having. Thank you. You're one of the few people that actually wants to have a discussion about all six national interests, not one of them,
yeah,
not. And so the judiciary needs Canadians to become involved and say clearly, and I don't mean by a 30-second post on X. Like
yeah,
you got to actually sit down and become engaged with your municipal order of government, your provincial order of government, and your federal order of government, and say not good enough.
yeah.
Here's what we as citizens want, right?
Well, and the other thing that, like, talking about the nominees for the Supreme Court in the United States, that's televised. You see it in Canada or on the internet. You could see traffic court in the United States online, and you see judges dispensing justice and being kind in certain cases. And in Canada, it's an open court system. It's available, but you have to go there. And since COVID, there's a lot more online, but in order to get it online, you still have to request it. And because of a lot of the cases I'm involved in have a big public interest component, I ask for that web link so that the public can watch. And I think in this day and age that there should be a lot more transparency with that so people can just watch, observe, learn, see how what is going on in the do I want to be admonished, do I want to be taken to jail for a speeding ticket or disrespecting the court or whatever have you, but it's just another opportunity for people to be engaged and learn.
That old
And so
saying,
that's
justice must not be done. It must not only be done, it must be seen to be done. So
yeah,
why don't the courts have a free and open website? And
yeah,
unless there's a specific reason for in camera, i.e.
yeah,
that piece will be not shown, it should just be always there. You can click on it anytime. You shouldn't have to
yeah,
go to somebody and beg for a link. It should
yeah,
be every court should have an open platform. In this modern age, people don't watch television. They watch web links on their computer. it,
yeah.
it should be a requirement of the court to have open access to the courtroom.
And you know how much more efficient it will be? I would suspect when people see that it takes an hour sometimes to get things started and people are sitting around and waiting because it's instant accountability.
Yes, the judges in their chambers because they got up late, yeah, or a lawyer didn't show up, or the person decided not to show up, and everybody waits for a witness or no. Let's
Yeah.
because when people know they're going to be found out, they perform a little bit better, and I don't mean by snitch lines. I mean by
Yeah.
actual performance of their daily duty.
Yeah.
Okay, so the judiciary and not
Yeah.
wanting to plug a horse, it's so critical that the judicial system holds the elected system accountable when they overstep their
Yes.
role. When
Yeah.
you have premiers acting like dictators, when you have a prime minister acting like a dictator, There must be a way for citizens to bring it to the court to have it in
Yeah.
a timely manner thrown out. And I don't want to ever hear the word moot.
Yeah.
This
I agree.
finding is no moot. We're not going to proceed with it. No, because
Ugh.
that same elected official or his replacement, his or her replacement, will try it again and do
Yeah.
it over and over and over and reverse it just in time so that it's always moot, right? But in the
Moot. Yeah.
meantime, they've destroyed people and their lives and their livelihood. So
Yeah.
moot cannot be a term. That's
Well,
Dave's.
gosh, you can't get more of an agreement from me on this. And not only that is like I represent people against the government. The government has, and like one judge described the federal lawyers as the largest law firm in Canada. They have the resources, they have the people, and yet they act like victims
Citizens
all
are
the
paying
time.
for them. They don't care. They
And
can take this
yeah,
on for 7 years.
yeah, and I find that just that's completely changed. I don't think that's the goal, the role of lawyers in the
No.
government bodies. That is just
They
not
can
their
drag
role.
it
So
out
I
so
have a
it
hard time with
becomes
that.
moot
Yeah.
intentionally.
Yeah, but I we have one more and we're
Okay, we are.
well into almost into 2 hours.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And this one I think we could again talk about for hours in itself, independent
So,
news
so,
media, or
so
we
I
could
think
just
this
say
one.
we don't have it.
I think people understand it. It's got to be investigative.
Yeah.
And its primary purpose for, and I remember I called it independent news media, not media,
Yes.
not for entertainment. The news media must be investigative, and its primary function is to hold government to account. So if you understand those two bullets, you understand why alternative media has come into being when you have a
Yeah.
prime minister who says Canadians should only listen to the CBC because that's the only place they'll get the complete information in a completely unbiased manner, knowing
Yeah.
full well that exactly the opposite is true. So it has
Yeah.
to be investigative, and its only function, news media, is to hold government to account.
Well, and I like that you said hold government to account because what we've seen with some of these news media, or I don't even know what to call it, is they're holding citizens to account
Correct.
more. They're holding opposition leaders that they don't align with to account more than the government. And to me, it's p- pathetic. That's the word I'm
Without
going to
that,
use
you
because
don't
then
have
it
a
becomes
democracy. Without
and
those
it
two
becomes
functions,
it becomes a gossip column, and that's what I see a lot of them doing, is they're talking about regular citizens more than they do about the government that's paid, by citizens to do public service and programs, and they're talking about individuals or people not in power,
their function
and like I said,
today
it's a
seems to
gossip
be to
column.
generate fear. And
Yeah,
fear is for whatever the government's latest initiative is. Fear,
yeah,
this will happen if you don't do what the government told you. That's the
yeah.
opposite of an independent media.
Yeah, no, it's just strange. And so, and I think it's such a ripe opportunity to provide anything but fear, education, information, even entertainment. And I think that's why voices are growing that are outside of the legacy media. I don't even like to call it mainstream.
Right.
I think it's old. I think it's going to end, because they did a disservice to themselves by not, um, like people are desperate for good information. People are desperate for uh, correct information, for helpful information. And it's if they're not going to provide it, somebody else will. And so
And
other
yet we're
people are filling
spending
up with it.
$2 billion
I
on
know.
a government propaganda machine.
I know. Yeah, that needs to go, in my
So
opinion.
under governance, if we look at all six, in a democracy, without all six of those, your democracy is in peril. And so your unity and your national security can be destroyed by bad governance. And without the first two, you don't have a country, right? And so the three that follow all are built on the foundation building blocks of a unified people who clearly understand the national security to defend their country with a governance model that supports the first three.
Yeah. Yeah, well, again, makes perfect sense to me. It seems rational, it seems practical, it seems effective, all these things that,
And so I
but
wrote
it,
the paper to engage
yeah,
Canadians, right? Not not
yes,
not to say everything that's wrong. And in the paper you'll see I start by describing where we were, how we got where we are, but then the whole second half is how to re-engage and how to
Yeah.
re-engage in a meaningful way using the six national interests to talk to your politicians at every order of government and to become engaged. So this should be a positive discussion. We're not trying to
Yeah.
tear anything down. We're trying to rebuild back to
Yeah.
what we could be and should be with a focused 25-year vision. And we elected officials based on a vision for the future, not on nitnoy little individual likes and dislikes.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's resonating because people are keen to hear more. So I think that whether those in power want to hear it, I'm not so sure about, but certainly there's a demand and a uh, gratitude from citizens. So we'll keep trucking along
Thank
here.
you, Eva.
Thank you so much. And I look forward to the next one.
Absolutely.